So today's tutorial is on Jekyll. So I have tried my best to kind of break this down into an easy to follow tutorial. So when I was learning about it, I kind of just jumped in the deep end and decided I wanted to make my own personal website. I had chatted a little bit with Francois about it and just kind of got stuck into trying to figure out how it all works. So I've kind of tried to reverse engineer back from my website to kind of break it down into the core components that make up a Jackal website and then explain those to you in the simplest possible way. So this is what I ended up with. So just at the beginning, I'm going to just introduce what the requirements for following this tutorial are, how to install Jackal. Hopefully you've already done this part, so we don't have to waste any time. So then part 3, what I'm going to do is very quickly show you how easily we can get a simple, very standard website up and running in less than 10 minutes. So it might take a little bit longer as I'm giving you the demonstration, but if you were to do this yourself, I'm sure you could have something up and visible to the world in less than 10 minutes. So then I'm going to just talk a little bit more about deployment and how you could, have your website up on your general GitHub account or on a GitHub organization. Then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to make it a bit more like your own. So you could, how to customize the way it looks and things. And then at the end, I'm actually going to explain how Jekyll works. So the point being is that if you really wanted something simple, you could kind of follow up to point 5 and you could be done. And then if you really want to dive deeper, that you could go into section 6 and 7 to really understand and tweak things to exactly the way you want them. Okay, so for requirements, the only 2 things you need to follow this tutorial are 1, a GitHub account. And that's because I want to be able to demonstrate to you the deployment and so that you can deploy something yourselves to test that it works. And 2 is Jekyll itself, the software. And that's so that you can do the development locally. So in principle, it's completely possible to do any of what I'm going to say today without either of these things. So what I mean by that is that if you don't have a GitHub account, you could make a Jekyll website and host it on a different server. You don't actually have to use GitHub at all. But it is definitely the easiest way to deploy a Jekyll website. And secondly, you don't actually have to do anything locally if you didn't want to. You could build an entire Jekyll website online without ever having to do anything locally, but I wouldn't recommend that because I think it would be very hard to test things. So this is the recommended procedure. As for installation, so Jekyll is written in Ruby and therefore is completely dependent on Ruby. If your computer does not have Ruby already installed, you won't be able to install Jekyll straight away. You'll have to install Ruby first. So I think almost all operating systems I'm familiar with usually come with Ruby pre-installed. And if that's the case, then you just need to run that line and you should be able to install Jekyll. If not, there's installation instructions on the Jekyll website for various different operating systems that will help you get started. Okay, so has anyone not got Jekyll installed? Okay, I will take that as a positive. So let's go and build our first website. Okay, so we're going to just go through things quickly, and then towards the end, we're going to go back.
Sam, can I ask you? Yeah. If somebody, yes. Okay, as an alternative to GitHub, there are other, I don't know how to call them, like other ways you can have a.
Yes. So in principle, all Jekyll is going to do is build a bunch of static HTML files for you. So any place that you can store the HTML files and make them visible on any server will work. So if you had your own, server, you could host a Jekyll website. If you had a GitLab account, you could use GitLab instead of GitHub. There are many options. So the reason that I'm going to focus on GitHub is that the GitHub pages that launches the websites is written in Jekyll itself. So it's a very natural way to host a Jekyll website. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I have Ruby, but I didn't install yet. I've seen I open now your link, so I haven't installed Jekyll. But in particular, if I run your code, it tells me that I don't have permissions to access the library where Ruby is. So I don't know. I have to see.
Okay. So if you click on this link here, you can see that there are installation instructions, and in particular for different operating systems.
Yeah, I'm trying already those ones.
Okay.
But you can, so I think it's trying to install things on your system, but there's like a -- user thing that allows you to.
This line here. So yeah, try that, and that might solve your problem. Okay, so in principle, it shouldn't take too long to have Jekyll installed. So I'll just wait maybe just 2 minutes to give everyone a chance to get it installed if they haven't already. In the meantime, for those of you who have already installed Jekyll, what you're going to need to do next is either fork this repository, so the repository I'm on here. So if you go up to the top right, you'll see that there is this fork button. So if you just click that, it's going to create a copy of this repository onto your own account. Alternatively, you can just create a new repository of any name you want on your GitHub account. So if you go to your GitHub account, you click on repositories, and then new. You can create any, put any name you like. That's really up to you. It doesn't make any difference to this tutorial. You don't need to initialize with the README unless you want to. But the one thing you should do is here on where it says git ignore, click there. And then if you write Jekyll, click that. And then when you create the repository, it will initialize with the git ignore that's specific for Jekyll, right? So once you've done that, then you need to clone the repository. So if you've forked it, just clone your fork. If you've created a new repository, just clone the repository that you've made. So if you forked, it should look like this. It should be exactly this line where you simply put in your username here. And once you've cloned your repository, we're going to go over to the terminal. And I've put my terminal on jumbo mode, so it's nice and clear for everyone. And with your cloned repository, you're just going to cd to the directory that it downloads. Okay, and then you should see something like this. Okay, so once everyone's at this stage, we're inside the Jekyll directory. What you're going to do is, if you forked my repository, then all you need to do is git checkout gh pages, and we're going to go to the gh pages branch. Okay. And if instead you created your own repository, then you need to create the branch and check it out. So then it's just the same command, but with this -b option. Right, so what you've done now is simply created a new branch with a specific name, which is GH Pages. So GH Pages is actually a special branch name used by GitHub to identify GitHub Pages content. Okay, so we'll come back to this in a little bit. So it is also possible to have Jekyll or GitHub Pages in particular recognize content that's on the master branch, but the default will be this GH Pages branch. So that's what we're doing right now. Okay, so once we're at this stage, you're in the GitHub Pages branch. What we're going to do is run through this Jekyll quick start instruction. So you can go through these by yourself if you want, and I recommend that you do if you really want to get a better understanding of this. But what I've done is kind of slightly modified these instructions to fit this tutorial. So what we're going to do first is we're going to run Jekyll new, and what that's going to do is create a new Jekyll site. Normally, in the normal procedure, what you do is Jekyll new and then the name of a directory, and it would create a new directory. But I don't want it to create a new directory because all of the content needs to be in the root of the GH pages. So what I'm going to do is tell Jekyll to create, put the content in the current directory. Jekyll doesn't like this, so I'm forcing it to do it, right? So it's not really a problem, but it's just to explain what that command is all about. So if you run that command.
Sam?
Yes?
Sorry. When I git check out the GH pages,
yes,
I have something different. I have a branch GH pages set up to track and switched to a new branch, which is called like that. And if I list the content, I don't see the docs.
I don't know. See docs. Sorry, I didn't make that clear. But the directory should be empty. The only thing that you can see is if you do an ls-a, you should see the .gitignore file and nothing else.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Perfect.
Okay. So then you run this command Jekyll new dot.
Of course, I cannot do that, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
don't worry about that. If you don't have Jekyll installed, you won't be able to do this, but we'll be able to do something else in a minute. Okay. So what that will do is it's going to unpack a new Jekyll site, and you can see all the commands that it's run. And now you should see the following files in your directory. Okay. And now what we're going to do is run this command, which is going to launch the Jekyll server.
Sam, can you tell me in which directory Jekyll is installed? Because installation has been done, but he doesn't found it, so it should be somewhere.
Normally it should be accessible to the bin.
Can you just write down where Jekyll? Or which Jekyll? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so as I said, we're going to launch the Jekyll server. So we're going to write bundle exec Jekyll serve. And you should see something like this pop up. And this server address is where you're going to be able to see the site locally. So if I go to this address, you should see something like this. So this is just the basic template for a new Jekyll website. So it says your awesome site, has an about page, it has one post, it says welcome to Jekyll, and then it has some random content, right? So if you're at this stage, I'd just like you to click around and you can see that it works exactly as you would expect for a website to work. You can scroll up and down, all the links work, the external links work, and so on. So most of you are able to see this?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so anyway, what you can see pretty much looks like a website, but of course it's very plain and doesn't really have any content in it. So feel free to play around just to see that you can see that it works and everything. Once you're satisfied that it works, we're going to go back and we're going to write Control-C to kill the server. And we'll come back to here and we'll go back. And what we're going to do now is just to do some basic configuration. So we're just going to tell Jekyll what the name of the website is and add some very standard content. So the most
just a question.
Yeah.
I've got some errors. Apparently, it doesn't find some icons. I don't think that's pretty important, but
no, yeah,
I'm missing some other stuff.
So it's this favicon error. Yeah, I had a look at this. It's something you can fix if you really want to, but it's not important at all.
Okay.
So just in case you're curious, the little icon that comes up in the tabs, like for example, that's a favicon.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, so the most important thing inside this configuration file, so there's a file called _config.yaml, right? _config.yaml. inside that file, we're going to see the following content. And you can see there's a lot of commented out stuff, and then a few lines. Right, so the most important lines in there are these two. So base URL and URL. All right, so base URL is the name of the GitHub repository. Right, so in this case, if you fork to the repository, the name of the repository is Jekyll tutorial. Don't forget to put the slash at the beginning. And then the URL is going to be your username .github.io. Right, now if you created your own repository, then this will be whatever the name of the repository you created is. Okay, so we're gonna add these to our configuration file. So in fact, I'm just gonna copy and paste this content. You're free to change the other things if you want, but make sure you leave the theme alone. So you can change everything up until here and just leave this part alone for now. Okay, save those changes. And now we're going to relaunch the Jekyll server. Okay, so firstly, you're going to see that some of the content has changed. So first, the title of the website I changed to Yoda's House. And we can see here it's called Yoda's House. I changed my email to yoda@force.com. And we have down here yoda@force.com. I have added a description of the website. You can see the description is printed here. I have added the base URL. And in fact, if you look at the URL for now for the website is actually changed. So it's not just your local host thing, it's also slash the repository name. Then, yeah, there's some Twitter and GitHub account links at the bottom. And that's pretty much it, right? So everything else looks the same as it did before. We can still click on everything and it still works. Okay, so now we've done the basic configuration for our website. You can leave the server running because we can actually modify content while the server is running and it will automatically update everything. So we're going to show this now. So in section 5, what we're going to do is add some basic content to our website. So it really doesn't matter what you put in, but we just need to put some content. So let's start with the, so I'm having issue because the Zoom controls are in the way of my tabs. Okay, we're going to start with the index, right? So this is the home page. So you can just say, for example, something like that. Now, if we come back to our server and reload, you can see it's added the content to the page. Right, and similarly, if we open the about, we can see there's some content already, and we can change this content to something for ourselves. We reload and we go to about, and you can see it's automatically updated this content. Okay. So now we can see, all right, how we can modify the existing pages, but what if we want to add some new pages? Well, we can just create a new markdown file. So I'm going to call one cv.markdown. I'm going to copy and paste the header from the about page. I'm going to leave the layout alone. I'm going to change the title of the page to CV, and I'm going to change the permalink to CV as well, and then add some content. Okay, so I have some content, and if I reload the page, you can see now there is a new tab for CV. If I click on that, you can see the content that I added to my markdown rendered automatically. So I think it's safe to say now is as many pages as I add in markdown, I will get the corresponding pages appearing here, and whatever I put inside the markdown will appear inside the page itself. Okay, and everything still works. Okay, so next we're going to create a post. So if we go here, there's a posts directory, and you can see that there's already a first post that they give you as an example. So we're going to make a new one, and the file name format will be year, month, today is the 3rd, and then title of our post, and finally the file extension. So note that .markdown and .md are equivalent. Okay, so again, I'm going to copy and paste the header from this example post here. I'll leave the layout. I'm going to say, give it a title. I don't really need the time here, so I'll just leave the date. And I can add any category I like, for example, news. Add some content to the post, and we go back to the server. Again, I can't click anywhere because of the stupid Zoom. Okay, there we go. All right, reload, and we can see here our post has been rendered. Okay, so I think you should have a pretty good idea now how you could start building a website with this example template, right? You could add as many pages as you want, you could add as many posts as you want, and you don't have to write any HTML, CSS, or anything else. You can just do everything in Markdown. So anything that you would usually do to make a page like this will work here. So the nice thing, of course, is that allows you to write code blocks. And they will be rendered inside your Markdown automatically as HTML. So for me, this is like the true beauty of using Jackal is that you have the simplicity of writing Markdown, but Markdown actually has quite a lot of that you can do with it. So you can get a lot of functionality with very little effort.
Sorry, Sam, question. In the post,
yeah.
When I created a file with year, month, date format, it says that the format is not correct, like the invalid date. So how did you write it?
Did you put the wrong dates or?
No, I don't think so. Let me see.
What I've put is 2020-04-03-my-post.md.
Yeah, I put 2020. I mean the same -news.md, and then it complains like error, invalid date. Does not have a valid. I mean the file doesn't have a valid date in the YAML front matter.
Okay, so did you make sure the date here is correct in the front matter? So this is the front matter, this little header. We're going to talk about this a bit later.
Of the post?
Yeah,
okay,
inside the post, you have to have a date that's in the same format.
Wait.
So the best thing is if you take...
Okay, yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so I think everybody should be hopefully pretty clear up until there what we've done. There's really nothing magical. Feel free to play around with this, example where you could, add, an actual CV. You could add actual information about yourself. You can add images and things to the Markdown, and they will be rendered in the HTML. Okay. For the moment, this is enough content just to give you an example. And now what we're going to do is we're going to close the server.
Sam?
Yeah.
So everything has to be in Markdown. There is no way to.
So you have two options.
Files.
You have two options. So basically, you can write it directly in Markdown or in HTML. Right. So I can do one example of an HTML file. So if I go here and I create a new file, let's call it hobbies.html. So the nice thing is that it takes the same front matter in HTML or Markdown. So okay, and that should work. And there you go. See?
Okay.
So basically, it works exactly the same way. But now, I could just write some more fancy HTML tags on top of this, and do whatever I wanted inside this file, and it will render the equivalent HTML here, right? So the thing that Jekyll's doing, the only thing that Jekyll's really doing here is taking the markdown and converting it to HTML for you. So if you write it in HTML already, it doesn't have to do any conversion. It just renders the HTML. If you write it in Markdown, it converts to HTML and then renders the HTML.
Okay, so also what I meant is, for example, you talk about the CV. So
yep.
I have one in LaTeX, but I will have to rewrite it in Markdown or HTML.
Actually, we're going to come to this a little bit later. So I'm going to come back to your question in about 10 or 15 minutes.
Okay.
Okay. So as I said, we have enough content just for an example. So I'm going to close the server. And now you can imagine, let's say we've already put all the effort into building our website. So we played around with this local server. We've put in all the content we wanted. And now we want to put it up online so that everyone can see it. Okay. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to deploy it. So this is now, if you followed Zachary's Git tutorial last week, you should have all of the expertise to do this. What we're going to do is check the status where you can see all of these new files have been created in this branch. We're going to add all of them. And we go Git status again. You can see they've all been staged. Right? We're going to commit these changes. So I think I wrote this as the example message. Everything's now committed. And then what you're going to do is push those changes to the remote repository. So if you forked, it's just git push origin GitHub pages. If you created your new own repository, then you need to set the upstream. So okay, and now we'll just see how slow my internet. Oh, that's okay. That's not too bad. Okay, so now if I scroll back up here and I change to the GitHub Pages branch, you can see I have a bunch of files that are now been included in this branch. Okay. So let me just show you something. So in settings, we can check on the status of our GitHub pages. So this is settings right here in the repository. You scroll down, there's a section called GitHub Pages. It will tell you, one, where your pages have been published. And it also tells you where the source of the GitHub Pages content is. So I told you by default, it's on a special branch called GitHub Pages. I could actually change this to the master branch or the docs folder on the master branch, or I could disable GitHub Pages entirely. So I'm going to leave the default alone, and I'm going to open up this link. And we can see all of the content that we had locally is now online, and it works. So if you've made it up into this part, you've actually deployed a Jekyll website. So well done. Just keep in mind that it's possible that it would take a minute or two for the Jekyll to render. So sometimes it's not instant. So if you still see a 404, you might need to wait a minute or two before, and you might also want to refresh the cache on your browser. Sometimes it caches the page, and so if you press refresh, it's not actually refreshing the page. So on my computer, it's Shift-Command-R to refresh with the clearing the cache. Anyway, can anybody just let me know if they managed to deploy their website? Great.
Yeah.
How about, sorry?
Yeah, actually, okay, I pushed everything back on GitHub, but I cannot, like, okay, I missed the point, I guess.
Yeah, I think that was a bit fast, but
sure. We can go through it again. Yeah. Okay, so what you should have done, so I'll go in this document, is once you've made all the changes to the so we were working on the local server, if you remember. So we had this bundle exec Jekyll serve command. We added some content to all of the files. Once we were happy with those, we closed the server.
Can you show us the two files that you have built?
Sorry?
Can you show us the two files, markdowns, that you have changed?
Yes. Okay. So in the direct, can you see my atom? Yep. Okay, great. So the files I changed were index.markdown. So this is one of the default files that was built by Jekyll. And I just added this line to it at the bottom. Welcome to my website. I also changed about.markdown, which was one of the other files that was built by Jekyll when we initialized. And I added this line. This is a page about me. That's all I added. And I can just show you here that we have on Yoda's house, we have welcome to my website. This is a page about me. So that's exactly what's written in the markdown. So then I created a new page called cv.md. cv.md. I copied the header from about. I changed the title to CV. I changed the permalink to CV. And then I added some content. So in this case, I just wrote, this is my CV, added a section called work experience, added another section called education. Right, so if we click on CV, we can see CV, this is my CV, work experience, education. Then I also added at Axel's request, hobbies.html, just to show you that I could also do the same thing, writing an HTML file rather than a markdown file. So again, you copy the same header, you only change the title and permalink to match the file name. And then I just added, these are my hobbies inside of a span. And you can see that, these are my hobbies. Finally, I added a new post, which I called my post. It has the same date as the default that was created by Jekyll. I copied the header from the Jekyll post, put it into mine, changed the title and changed the categories, and also just removed the timestamp from the date. You could have left it, it's fine, I don't need it. And then I added this line and this code block in Python, right? And then if we go back to here, we can see my first post, this line, and the code block in Python. Is that clear? Or rather, should I say, was that unclear for anyone?
No, so far so good for me.
Okay, great. Was that okay for you, Jean-Luc?
Yes.
Okay, great. So after we did all of that content, I closed the server. So I don't want to be developing anything locally anymore. I ran git add dot to stage all of the files that were changed. I ran git commit -m upload Jekyll content to commit those changes. And then I did git push origin GH pages to push that content to the remote repository. So since I'm working on my own repository, you can see if I switch to the GitHub pages branch, I can see all of the files. So I have the cv.md, the hobbies.html, I have the posts, my post in the default post. Exactly the same content that I just modified is now available online. Now, I did nothing else other than push these files onto this special branch, and automatically GitHub will render the Jekyll for you. So you don't have to do any extra steps. Once the content has been pushed to the GH pages page, it will work. So there's nothing special about Jekyll in this sense. So all it's done is created HTML content out of this content here. Okay, so one thing I'm going to just highlight is if we go back to our remote thing, our local thing, you'll see that there's an extra directory called _site. I don't know if anyone noticed that. So after you close the server, you will have noticed that this new directory appeared. If you open this directory, you can see that it looks pretty similar to what we have outside, but now everything is in HTML. So we have index.html, we have about, we have CV, we have hobbies, and each one of them is an HTML file. And you can see here is the HTML that's been generated by Jekyll from the Markdown. So you can actually see exactly what Jekyll has done to your Markdown in order to render that HTML. So in principle, you never have to touch this, this directory. This is essentially just the build directory from Jekyll. And you'll notice that the remote online repository does not have this site. And that's because basically GitHub Pages does the build behind the scenes and renders the HTML for you. So anytime you make a change to this thing, it will automatically rebuild that site directory and render all the HTML that's inside of it. So you don't have to do that at all. So you don't need you should definitely not push the site directory to the remote repository. And that's why we have this git ignore. So if you remember back at the beginning, if you created your own repository, I told you to include this one. And what's inside this thing is it tells GitHub what not, well, sorry, Git what not to include. And one of the first things is site. So basically it says don't track this directory, do not upload this directory, don't use anything for this directory, right? And that's because GitHub Pages will do all of that for you. Okay, so hopefully you are all able to make it to this point, and in which case you've passed the first test, which is to make a Jekyll website, right? And even only up to that point, you have enough where you could make your own website, even in the simplest form, right? You could have your CV, you could have a list of your publications, you could have a small bit of information about who you are and where you work, and that's already better than nothing, right? So a lot of people have no website at all. If you had even that minimum amount of information, and this is, you know, not particularly ugly, it's not the most beautiful website, but at least it's very functional and clean. So up until that point, you should be at least good to go with a very, very basic Jekyll website. So we're going to move on to now this section on deployment. For Valeria, if you're still on.
Yeah.
So one thing you can do, since you forked the repository, if you want to test this remote thing that is working, you can go to Settings and scroll down to GitHub Pages, and then change from the GitHub Pages branch to the master branch docs folder. So if you click on that, it's going to tell GitHub Pages to look at the master branch rather than the GitHub Pages branch. So if we go back to the repository, you can see on my master branch, there's this docs directory that we haven't talked about. So in the docs directory, all I've done is already pre-rendered a website using Jekyll in exactly the same way that I talked you through, but I've already added some content before we started, just as an example, right? So if you did everything I just showed you, you don't need to do this. But if you weren't able to do this, at least you can have a look at this example just to see how it's going. So if I try to refresh this with a cache, you can see here's the pre-rendered version of this website I made. So I had the same thing. We have now with a picture of Yoda. On the about page, it just says this, okay, actually this needs to be recached as well. I have some inspirational quotes by Yoda. I have Yoda's CV, and I have a special posts page with Yoda's posts. And inside there, you can find some very nice YouTube videos of Yoda singing. If you've never seen them before, you should check it out. Okay, so essentially it's the same sort of thing we just did, but I just added a teeny bit more content just to show you that even with this very, very basic template, you could already start to make a fairly cool website with some, you know, embedded YouTube videos, with a whole section with like a blog about yourself, and so on. Okay, any questions up until that point?
Yeah, does it allow to have databases like?
Absolutely not. So this is fundamental to how GitHub Pages works, is that it is static. So static means no database. So no WordPress.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so next, what we're going to do, like I said, we're going to talk about deployment. So for the example, I just wanted to show you how you could take any just generic GitHub repository and put a website on it. So normally, If you were making your personal website, you wouldn't want to do this because you want each repository to have maybe its own website where it has the API documentation for your code or whatever. And you'd like your own personal website to be kind of abstracted from that. So that is completely possible with GitHub. The difference is that we don't need to make a special GitHub Pages branch. What we need to do is make a special repository. So what we're going to do, well, so this is optional. You don't have to do this right now. It's just so that you know how it works. What you need to do is go to create a new repository, and instead of just giving it any name, we're going to give it the very specific, your GitHub username.github.io. So for me, it would be right. So it tells me this already exists because I've already created that. And then you don't need to do anything else, maybe except for adding the Jekyll git ignore, but in principle, you could even do that later. So when you do that, it's going to create a special repository, which basically works exactly the same way as a GitHub Pages branch, but it's the master. So if I go to my special GitHub Pages branch repository, you can see here I have all of my website content hosted on the master branch, and I don't have any other branch. And so essentially you could follow exactly the same steps we did in the first example, except that you just push everything to the master branch of this special repository, and it will render the whole website, and the address of your website will be your username.github.io. So if you remember on this example, it was the same thing, my username.github.io, but / the repository name. So since there's no repository associated with this special GitHub Pages, then it's just the root, right? So I can show you what mine looks like. And there we go. So this is my website rendered using Jackal. And I have a section where I talk about who I am, where I work, things that I work on, the presentation I gave at EuroSciPy last year, and some more things. I've got my CV. Again, this is all written in Markdown, right? So there's some extra rendering steps, but the content is only just in Markdown. I have all of my publications with links to ADS, to archive, directly to the PDF, directly to the BibTeX. On each one, you can read.
For example, for the publications, I mean,
yes.
Without the database, how did you have to insert them?
So this was so basically these are just posts. So exactly the same way as the posts work here. It's just that I have them rendered in a special way using CSS. But in fact, all this page is a list of posts. And what I've done is written some special CSS that tells it when you have a new post to show the post title, show an excerpt from the post, the names of the authors of the post. Then I have an image associated to the post, which it renders here, and so on. And then if I click on it, you can see that it's just the post, and it actually has the same post format with the date and everything. And so then, yeah, I've done the same thing from software and tutorials, and then I have a special personal blog section. And again, these are just posts. I just rendered them slightly differently. Okay, so that's how you would make your own
website.
Sorry?
Very nice website.
Thank you very much. I think a lot of the what makes it nice is really down to Lana's artwork, but it was still fun to make. Okay, so that's how you would make your own personal website. Now, if you had an organization, for example, like the CosmoStat organization, you could actually make an organization website in pretty much exactly the same way. So the only difference would be instead of your username.github.io, it's the organization name.github.io, and the website will be on the organization.github.io. So that's where you would find it. So you would do exactly the same procedure. You create this special repository, upload everything to the master branch, and then it will be visible there. Okay, is that clear so far? Yeah, great. Okay, I saw a couple of nods. Okay, so next section is on customization. So we learned how to make a very basic website and get it online, which is the most important thing, right? Once you can get your website online, then you're in good shape. So you might want to add a little more personal flavor to your website, make it look a little bit more like what your interests are. So the default theme in Jekyll is called Minima. So if we go, oops, close that. Back to here, I can close some of these windows. So if we go back to the config file, we can see here that there's a section called theme, and the value associated to it is called minima. Okay, so that is basically telling Jekyll to use this minima theme, and you can find out more about this theme on their GitHub repository. It will tell you about some of the options that you can add to this theme. So it is actually possible to add some more customization to this basic theme if you want. But if you don't like that theme, there's actually a huge library of Jekyll themes available, right? So they have all sorts of different styles, very similar to something like WordPress or whatever. But again, these are all static HTML themes, right? And there are many, many pages of very different ones. There's a Homer Simpson theme. There's all sorts of stuff. So if you don't want to invest the time in building your own theme, you probably will find something here that you like well enough to use. Okay, so once you've decided you want to change the theme and use a different one, there's two ways you can do it. So you can either change the theme locally, and what you would do is simply update the value of theme in your config file here, and that will tell it to use that theme. I'll just show you what it looks like at the moment. All right, so it looks like this. So I'm sourcing this website called Ruby Gems, and then I have various gem commands and values afterwards. So the first one is actually telling Gem to which version of Jekyll to use, and the second one is telling it which version of Minima to use. So of course, if we change the theme in the config, we also need to make sure that the gem file updates with the theme as well, right? So essentially, we'd add Jekyll, for example, if we wanted to use this Cayman theme, so I'll just show you what the Cayman theme looks like. So if we wanted to use this theme, we would change the theme to Jekyll theme Cayman in config, and then we would add gem Jekyll theme Cayman to the gem file. All right, so what the gem file is doing is you can kind of think about it like a Conda environment file or a Docker file or something like this. It's essentially telling Ruby to install this theme when my config file tries to look for it. Okay, so then once you've changed that locally, then you would run bundle update, which basically tells everything to update the current contents of your gem file. So it's like to reprocess the content of the gem file, and then you could launch the local server again and you would see the new theme. What I'm going to show you right now is how you would do it on GitHub. Right, so you've got your website already. So we've got Yoda's house live, but we don't like this theme, so we want to change the theme. Right, so what we're going to do is we're going to go to settings. We're going to go back down to the GitHub pages section, and before I demonstrated how to change from the GitHub pages to the master docs folder in case you couldn't get that to work. But you can see here just below there's another button that says change theme. So if I click on that, you can see it actually has a nice little slider with some example themes and what they look like. So I'm going to go ahead and select the Cayman theme. And if we scroll back down to the GitHub pages section, you can see here it says your site is currently using the Cayman theme, right? So you know which is the current theme. And if we go back to the website and we go to docs folder where I'm currently doing, so this would be, if you're doing this, would be on your GitHub pages branch. If I go to the config file, you can see theme, the value of theme is now updated to Jekyll theme Cayman. Right, so this is exactly what you would have done locally. GitHub just does that for you, so you don't even have to update this file yourself. So now what we're going to see is that there's going to be a problem. So if I reload this page, we can see the website's broken, right? And the reason for that, we're going to get into this in a bit more detail, has to do with the front matter, so the header in the files. So if we look inside here, so we have this index.markdown file. So index.markdown, this one. You can see that the layout is home, all right? So the thing is that not every theme is going to use the same layouts. So if you try to call a layout that doesn't exist in the theme, it's not going to work. So what we can do is we can just edit this file. Yeah, and we're going to change the layout from home to default. So almost every theme in Jekyll will have a default theme, and it's pretty bad practice if they don't. So you're almost always going to be safe if you use default. Okay, so we're going to change that to default. I'm going to commit the changes there. And then if we go back here, and it might take a few minutes for it to update. In the meantime, I can go back and update a couple of the other files. So if we remember, we had about. So about is using a layout called page. So page might not exist. So let's set that to default as well. And let's see if in the meantime, is this updated? No, come on. Okay, here we go. So now you can see the page is rendered in this K-min theme. So we lose some of the functionality because those pages have disappeared, and that's because this theme doesn't support the same things that Minima does. So this is something you have to take into consideration. If you're going to change the theme, it might affect some of the functionality of your website. But if you look and read the documentation of that theme, you might be able to figure out how to do something similar. But as you can see, it's pretty trivial to already start changing the look of your website. And you didn't have to do anything special other than changing the name of the theme and possibly changing the layouts of your pages to a different format. Okay, is that clear so far? Yeah, okay.
You were in the GH Pages branch, right?
Well, so I'm not, because I changed to docs to demonstrate, but you guys should be on GH Pages branch.
Okay.
Right, so basically the thing to always check, in case of your doubt, what you should check is go down to the settings, go to the section that says GitHub Pages, and see where the source is. So the source for you should be GitHub Pages branch. I've changed it to master branch docs folder, but for you it should be GitHub Pages branch. So then you know exactly where GitHub Pages is looking for Jekyll content. Okay?
Okay.
And that's where you should be modifying things if you want to. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's how you would change your theme, right? So as I mentioned, you could also make your own theme. So if you really want to invest a lot of time, you could add to that nice carousel of different Jekyll themes, one that you've created yourself. So I'm not going to go into details of that because that's a little bit more complicated than what we're going to discuss today. But there's various blog posts where you can read all about how to make your own Jekyll theme from scratch, right? So that's if you really want to share with the community something that you've spent time on, you could do that. So the other thing that I want to talk to you about regarding customization are Jekyll plugins. So this comes back to Axel's question earlier about LaTeX. So Axel was saying, okay, imagine I have my CV already written in LaTeX. I don't want to have to rewrite it in Markdown. Well, in fact, there are many Jekyll plugins that do many different things. So you can read all about it on this page here. And it's definitely worth your time to find out if there's a plugin that does what you want before wasting your time trying to rewrite your content or rewrite an application that will do it for you. So it just so happens there is a plugin called Jekyll LaTeX, which allows you to write LaTeX pages in addition to Markdown and HTML. All right. So if you wanted to include that, what you would do is you would go to your config file. You would add to this list of plugins. So we have plugins. There's a default one called Jekyll Feed. I would add a new one called Jekyll LaTeX. I think that's all it's called. Yeah, Jekyll LaTeX. And keep in mind, as with the theme, if you want to add a new plugin, you're going to have to add it to your gem file so that the bundle installs that plugin when it rebuilds the website. So we would also add gem, anywhere in the file, gem Jekyll LaTeX. And then when we render this website, it will now have the ability to do LaTeX pages as well. So, I'm not going to talk to you about all the different plugins that are available, but if there's a specific functionality you want, it's worth looking into to see if somebody's already written a plugin for it. Okay, so I think that's the end of the basic part. So now I was going to get into a slightly more advanced thing, just explaining how Jekyll works. So there's nothing to do. This is just purely explanation, but it will certainly help you if you wanted to actually develop a slightly more sophisticated website. So is everybody good up until now? Okay. So now we're going to talk about how Jekyll actually works. So in the first bit, I just gave you a very quick how to get a website from 0 onto GitHub in under 10 minutes. Then I told you how you could deploy it as your main personal website. And then I showed you how you could customize the look of it a bit using themes and add some functionality using plugins. But I at no point really explained how Jekyll works. So that's what we're going to talk about now. So firstly, as I mentioned before, what does Jekyll do? Well, it's a static site generator. And so to answer Valeria's question, that means no database by definition. So you can see here, there's the Wikipedia definition of what Jekyll does. The simple explanation is what it does is it converts markdown files to HTML, which makes it easier for you to develop your website and maintain your website, right? If all you have to do is write a new markdown, it's much easier than having to write a whole new HTML page. Okay, so the structure of a general Jekyll website is the following. So you're going to have a config file. So we played around a little bit with this in the example. Right? What the config file does is it sets the configuration for your website, which is pretty obvious. So where you can define some variables, you can list plugins, you can specify the theme, and so on. Next, you will often have a data directory where you can specify additional YAML files. So this config file is a YAML, this .yml. But you could actually add many more YAML files. Like if you wanted to have more variables that specify certain things, like if, for example, the contents of your navigation menu, you could create a new YAML file for that specifically. Then you would have an includes directory. So includes are essentially just like little snippets of HTML. So rather than having one giant HTML file, you could break your HTML apart into pieces. So I could say, okay, I'm going to have one HTML file, which is my header, one HTML file, which is my footer, one HTML file, which is my navigation menu, and so on. And then you could break all of those pieces and store them in this directory. So layouts, we played with just a teeny bit. Layouts specify what the page should look like. So if you're on your home page, what should be how should that page be rendered? If I'm on a post, how should the post be rendered, and so on. So this is where the HTML files that specify what that content should look like is defined. Then we have the post directory, which is straightforward. It's just a directory where you store your posts. And the nice thing being is that, of course, you can just store them as markdown files. So I'm going to go through all of this in a bit more detail. So I'm just explaining what the structure is now. So then there's a SAS directory. So this is where you would define your style sheets. So basically the things that they specify all the classes that are going to be used by these HTML files. The site directory we already talked about is the build directory of Jekyll. So this is what Jekyll produces when it renders your markdown as HTML. Then you have an assets directory. So assets is where you can store like images or JavaScript or CSS or anything else, anything that's not really kind of related to the HTML markdown content. So then you have your gem file, which is basically the packaging description for your website. So essentially all the plugins, themes, and everything that need to be downloaded, and if they need specific versions, all this sort of stuff is specified in your gem file. So For someone who is used to Python, you could think about like, you know, a requirements.txt file or a conda environment file is kind of doing the same thing. It just specifies all the packages that should be downloaded and what versions of those packages should be downloaded. And then finally, you know, you have like an index, which is your homepage, and then any other .html or .md pages, which are all the pages for your website. Okay, so if you look at this content and then you compare that to what we had in our example, you can see that there's seem to be a lot of the things missing, right? And the reason for that is that a lot of this content is actually hidden inside the theme. So if you're using Minima or Cayman or another Jekyll theme, the layouts, the CSS assets, all of that sort of stuff is probably bundled inside the theme so that you can't see it. So you can override the content of those things. So if you look inside the GitHub repository for Cayman and you see what the default layout is and you want to override that layout, you could create your own layouts directory and put a new default .html file, which will override the pre-existing one, and then you can modify the content of one of those themes, right? So in order to do that, you'd have to dig inside the theme to see what is available and where it's specified, and then rewrite the content in your own directory to override that functionality. Okay, so that's a little bit complicated, but we're gonna go a bit slowly now and just talk about the different things that Jackal includes and what they do. So if anybody wants to like really understand all of these things, I'd recommend on top of this tutorial, following this step-by-step Jekyll tutorial, which is on the Jekyll website, where they really go through step-by-step explaining how everything works. So I've kind of taken a lot of that content and explained it in my own words. So I think you would probably be in better shape if you read both. Okay, so let's start with the first thing. So one of the things that Jekyll includes is called Liquid. So Liquid is used for templating. So I've got a link here to the Liquid templating websites where they tell you everything about what Liquid can do. So I'm just going to give you a very short introduction. So as I mentioned, everything that Jekyll generates is static HTML. So there's no database, but you can have some kind of semi-dynamic content in the sense that you don't have to manually write out every single piece of information hard-coded into your website. You can have some like variables that are called as Jekyll renders the website. So rather than saying, okay, the name of my the page I'm looking at is about, I could write page.title instead, right? So that means that if I copy this tag into all the different pages, I wouldn't have to write the name of the page in every page. It would automatically render the name of the page from this Liquid object. So an example of that, let me see, I can go to my personal website here. Okay, so we can look at the layouts I have for maybe a post. No, that's not a good one. Okay, that was a bit complicated. Okay. Okay, so here's the layouts that so I'm going to explain layouts a bit better in a second, but this is the layout from my home site. So let me open my website here. Right, so this is the home page, right? So on the home page, I have an image, right? So we can see here an image. I have some icons for various accounts. So here I have a Liquid statement, which is going to do a for loop over every item that's in my site.data. So I'm going to explain that in a second for icons. And then it's going to render the site image path and the item image. So essentially, this is where all of these images are getting applied. And then I have another one where I go from item in topics, and then I can render the image as well, but also the item name, right? So if we go here, we can see an image and the name. So image name, image name, image name. So I haven't written for this page publication software tutorials with 3 different images and 4 different images here. You can see here, instead I've got a loop over those items. So that's exactly what the liquid is doing, is it kind of allows you to write your HTML content more kind of like a code than just like really hard coded in the kind of more old fashioned way. So that way, you know.
Sorry, can you use it also in Markdown, or you have to do it in HTML?
You can use it in Markdown as well.
Okay.
So basically, almost everything works the same way in Jekyll, whether it's HTML or Markdown. And that's kind of the beauty of it. So you can write something in Markdown, you can include HTML tags, and you can include liquid all in the file, and then it will all get rendered into the appropriate HTML by Jekyll. So here,
okay, you can mix HTML and Markdown too, right? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So here's a very specific example that could be useful. So on this Yoda website, okay, so I don't think I updated this one. Okay, so I haven't updated this one with the appropriate theme. But you can see here I have a list of the posts on a page called posts, right? In order to do that, what I did is added this tag, right? So basically I said loop through the post in the site posts and give the URL and title of the post and an excerpt of the post. So we can see here is the name of the post, the URL because I can click on it, and an excerpt of what's written in that post is available here, right? So I haven't written out a page that lists all of my posts manually. I've written a for loop that will generate all of them for me. So that means that if I add a new post, it will automatically show up on this page and I don't have to do anything. Okay, so that's what Liquid offers you. Is that kind of clear so far? Okay, so now we're going to talk about front matter. So nobody asked the question, but I was hoping somebody would ask the question, is that where does the Liquid get these variable values from? Right, which would have been a really good question that nobody asked. So the answer to that question is it depends. So there are some predefined variables by Jekyll, which you can read all about on the Jekyll website, and it will tell you what these values mean. But everything else is defined by you. So essentially, if you write, in this example, site.posts, so where is site looking? Well, site is looking at your config file, essentially. So it's saying, okay, so in a very good example is the base URL. So when we asked, in the very first example, we set the base URL, which was the repository name. So that is specified in our config.yaml file. So if I call anywhere in my website site.baseURL, it's just going to take that value from the YAML file and use it. So here, example. In this, I need to specify the root URL, the base URL for this, and that's where it's getting that information from. Okay, so then I mentioned to you that you could have this data directory. So in the data directory, that means that if I wanted to find something from there, it goes site.data. the variable name. So I can show you this example. I had site.data.icons and site.data.topics from my website. So if I open the data directory for my website, you can see there's an icons and a topics YAML file. So if we open the icons one, you can see all I have done is provided a list of YAML items, and for each list I have a link and an image. So I have a link to CosmoStat website and an image, CosmoStat logo, link to GitHub website, GitHub logo, link to Twitter website, so on. And if we go back to my website, you can see CosmoStat logo, GitHub logo, Twitter logo, LinkedIn logo, and if I click on them, they take me to the appropriate websites. So the place that the website is getting that information from is this YAML file, right? So you can see here, site.data.icons, and then it's saying, okay, site, image paths, item image, and that's where it's getting from item, which is getting it from this YAML file. So it's all very logical. Okay, so then you have some more localized information, and this is what's called the front matter. So The front matter is exactly what we were looking at in our earlier example. So if we go back to the simple example, we could look at, for example, about. So and about, we have this little header. So essentially we have 3 dashes and 3 dashes, which is what defines the region of your front matter. And inside the front matter, it's actually just YAML. So this is exactly the same format as this. And you can see that. And essentially what that does is it kind of creates a local YAML file for the specific file you're dealing with. So in about.markdown, I have these extra variables I can call inside the page. So if I call page.title, the place that it's looking for the value title is here. And similarly, if I was in a post and I ask for a post.date, the place it's looking for the date is in this front matter. So that's all that's going on there. It's really very simple. And that's what all of those headers are doing. It's just providing some extra like YAML information. And what I was saying is that you can kind of look at the config and data as global YAML information for your website. And then the front matter in the top of any file as kind of local YAML information for that specific page or post. Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay. I got a couple of nods. Okay, so one thing to take into account is that Jekyll will only convert markdown files that have front matter. Right, so I'm just going to quickly demonstrate this. So I'm going to go back to this example website that we had. I'm going to relaunch the local server. Okay, so okay, all right. So I've got my local server up. All right, so I have these pages that I added already. So let's say I want to add a new page. All right, so I'm going to create a new file, and we're going to call it flags.md. So a website where I can list my favorite flags, something really useful. Okay, so when I reload this page, you can see that nothing's showing up here, right? And if I go to the site, you can see that it hasn't rendered any new page. So we have about, we have CV, we have hobbies, but there's no flags. So what I'm going to do now is just add an empty front matter. So I just add the 3 dashes and 3 dashes with nothing else. And you can see here now there's a flags.html file. And if I reload this page, right, you can still see it's not here, but if I go to flags, you can see it has rendered the HTML. Right now, if I wanted that to fit in with the rest of the website, I need to specify a layout. So I could say, okay, it's a page. And now it renders like a page, right? But it doesn't have a title, so we can give it a title. And we can give it a permalink. And now, but we should probably spell flags properly. There we go. And then it works. Okay. So that's exactly what the front matter is doing. Okay, so now we started talking about layouts just now, so I'll just explain what the layout is. So as I said before, it's what specifies what the look of a given page should be. Okay, so I have a couple of examples here. So we were looking at before when we changed the theme that we should probably set a default as the value, because not every theme is going to use the same layouts that the minima theme used. Okay, so here's an example of the default layout from my personal page. So I can just show you that that's true. So I go to my layouts directory, and then I'm going to click on default. I think or for posts, sorry, posts. Okay, so here's the layout for posts. All right, so I'm going to have a container where I put an image, basically. Right, and that's exactly what you're seeing here. A container with an image. All right, and so this is how that is defined inside my my website. So I'm telling the posts layout to use the default layout, which I'll show you now, as a kind of base to build upon. So essentially what it's doing is taking this layout and then adding this on top of it. So you can kind of nest your layouts essentially. So what I can do then is saying, okay, now that I have a basic post layout, I want a specific post layout for publications. So that's exactly what I did. So I made a post publication layout, which builds upon the post layout and then adds this extra content, right? So for example, I have the author, the journal, the year, the option to download it, and an abstract. So if we go back to the website and we look at the publications, you can see all of that information that I just listed. Okay. Right, so the other thing I wanted to mention about the layouts is that you don't have to build the entire layout in one giant HTML file. So this is where this includes directory comes into play. So let's look at this default layout in particular. So you can see here that it's a very short file, and this is the default layout for every single page on my website. Right, so that I have a body, and I have a header, well, a head, then I have a header, a navigation menu, page title, and then a footer. Okay, so the thing is, rather than writing this all into one giant file, I have this includes directory where I can specify specifically what the header should look like. So there's nothing in the header. I can specify what the navigation menu should look like. I can specify what the footer should look like. You can see here it's very simple. And if I look at the footer on my website, you can see that it's also that simple. So yeah, so essentially all the includes is doing is just giving you the ability to kind of abstract and encapsulate some of the HTML so that it's not so messy. So, and the nice thing is then, of course, you can take advantage of Liquid. So Liquid will allow you then to include pieces of your HTML back into this one thing. So when this gets rendered, it gets rendered as one giant HTML file. But when you're writing it, you can write it as nice little pieces that are easy to maintain. Right, so this is how we can kind of combine those concepts. Okay. Right, so that's for layouts. So assets, okay, so I mentioned this is essentially just where you store your images and CSS and so on. So I can show you in my website, we have assets, I have images. This is where the images are stored that make up my website. I have some JavaScript, and I have one CSS file that is going to include a thing called my style, which is in this directory, this SAS directory, so which is, I think, the next section. Okay, so have I lost everyone, or is everyone still following?
Following.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so if you made it this far, then you should have a reasonable idea of how Jekyll works, and you should know how to get a Jekyll website up online and add some basic customization to it. So now, if you're like, oh, your website's really cool, I want to make my website like that. So where does the actual work come in? So the actual work comes in writing style sheets. So style sheets are what makes everything look the way it looks. So if you want to say, okay, I want the image to have these rounded borders, I want these ones to have shadows, I want the menu to have a line underneath, I want the menu items to highlight in this color, I want to have these little blocks for my posts, I want the markdown to look, with this font, and I want to have this underline under header 1, and I want lists to look like this. And so all of that sort of stuff is all defined in your style sheets. So most of you are probably familiar, at least with the name CSS. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. So Jekyll uses something called Syntactically Awesome Style Sheets, which is a very cool name, which is shortened to SAS. So there's a nice website for SAS where they kind of give you a rundown of what SAS does. So in simple terms, it's just kind of like fancier CSS. And I quite like it because it's slightly Pythonic in the construction of how it works. So let me just show you an example. So I have my standard style sheet here, which is just called my style. And inside my standard style sheet, I'm doing almost like I would do in a Python script, is importing other modules that do different things. So if I want to write the style sheet specifically for the navigation menu, I can separate that into a navigation style sheet where I can keep things a little bit shorter and simpler and just write everything how the navigation works, and then import that into my standard style sheet. So then this one gets rendered as a giant style sheet by Jekyll. Okay. So the other thing it allows you to do are things called mix-ins. So this is extremely cool because one of the worst things about writing style sheets is having to copy and paste a million times the exact same thing. So if I wanted, a shadow on every box that shows up on my website, I'd have to put a shadow for every box that I create. Well, that's really stupid. So the nice thing that SAS allows you to do is you can write a mix-in. So I could define what the shadow should look like, and then I can just import that into any container that needs to use it. So then I essentially just define this once and then just use it anytime I need to add a shadow. So the other things that's really useful for, or imagine you have your website and you want it to work in both desktop and mobile. So what I can do is write a mix-in for desktop, a mix-in for mobile, and then I can specify what should change when you go from one version to the other, right? So if I change the width of the screen below a certain extent, it should go, use this option rather than this option, right? And that saves you a lot of time on adding a lot of functionality to your website. So this is not a tutorial on CSS, so I'm not going to sit and explain. If you want, I don't know, let me think of a good one. So, okay, here's for posts. If you want to know how I did every single thing for making the posts look the way they do, it would take a long, long time. But you can start to see some of the main components here. So I wrote a post container. I include the shadow in it. I set a border radius, which does the rounding of the edges. I said that if it's on desktop mode, it should use the full width of the page. If it's on mobile mode, it should do some slightly different things. I said that if you hover over the post, it should lighten the opacity just a fraction. So I can just demonstrate this. If it's my website and I hover over one of these things, you can see it dims just slightly. That's exactly where that's being defined. Okay, so that's pretty much everything I need to tell you about Jekyll. And so just before finishing, I have a couple of tips and tricks. So one is that if you have already, had some experience with HTML, you probably won't need to know this. But if you're either new to HTML or you've only ever done a little bit of HTML but never really learned properly, there's a couple of things you should know. So one is that you should use containers everywhere. So if you, like me, learned to write HTML like 20 years ago, then, you probably learned a lot of bad things, bad habits, like making lots of tables and things like that. The thing is that, in modern HTML, you can do things extremely cleanly and extremely simply just using these style sheets. So you write a container. So for example, I have body and main, this is the default template. So it is extremely short and extremely simple because essentially all of the functionality and look is just defined in these style sheets. So I just give a container and then I tell the container what it should look like. And then it makes it very easy to manage because then the HTML stays very simple and almost doesn't change at all. And all you have to do is sit and play with your style sheets until you get things to look the way you want them to. Okay, second tip is to use the Jekyll plugins. As I mentioned, that there's many things that you can do with these plugins that are, will save you a lot of time. I have one example here is that personally, I have a pet hate of external links that open in the same tab. So this is something that kind of drives me crazy about GitHub, for example. If you go to any GitHub repository and you click on an external link, it just loads inside the same tab. And I don't like that. So, one thing you could do is like, the brute force old-fashioned way is adding a target blank to every single external link that you write, which is a bit of a pain. Or you could go crazy and write some fancy JavaScript that do it for you. But in fact, there's a Jekyll plugin that just does it. All you have to do is install this plugin, tell your website to use it in the config file, and then you have that functionality built in. Okay, and so the last tip and the last point of this tutorial is to treat your website like a code, right? So since you're storing your code, your website on GitHub, you can actually manage it exactly the same way as you would any other software repository. So, one is that you can keep your code nice and clean. You can keep it well documented so that you yourself can understand what the code of your website is doing. But you can also add things like CI tests for your website to make sure that you don't break it yourself. So there's a nice article here on the Jackal website that explains that, where you can use, like Travis, you can add a CI file that will tell Travis to run every time you make a change to your website and make sure that it still renders. So if you change something in your style sheet that breaks your website, it will give you an error before you deploy it, and then in that way you don't crash your website. Okay, and then I have just a little trick here in case anybody has issues with this HTML proofer, just because I had some issues with it and I found a solution there. Okay, so that is all I have to say. Are there any questions?